When we learn about someone's patterns and relationships, we often learn a lot about their striving and their goals and their lifestyle, because the things that attract us to people often show you a lot about people's lifestyle. Is they're striving to be like very vertical, to really be wanting to be the best and to be seen as the best, or being with the most attractive person or the most successful person.
Welcome to Jagged Edge. It's a leadership podcast, and today we have Dr. Jonathan Sperry. So many of us are questioning ourselves, especially after the last 3 years of changing environment, especially in the workplace. And one thing that's really certain, human behavior and development. And who better than Dr. Jonathan Sperry to share with us Adlerian Psychology, how we behave, our behavior, or just a lot of different terms that helps us understand our employees, our team members, so we could encourage them, empower them, and work in a cohesive way. Dr. John Sperry, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. I'm sitting here in South Florida, in Boca Raton, Florida, and I'm a clinical mental health counseling professor at Lynn University. So I've been teaching here for 10 years and really doing a lot of training of folks who are hoping to become mental health professionals. And before being in the teaching world, I was working as a mental health professional, like a therapist in substance abuse treatment programs, where I was doing talk therapy with individuals and group settings with folks with addictions, behavioral addictions, and substance-related addictions. So that's some of my background a little bit as far as therapy. And then over time, I worked in college counseling centers, doing talk therapy with students. And I've been working at Florida Atlantic University's counseling center for the past 15 years and really love that work and that population. And yeah, before that, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and both of my parents are connected very much to Adlerian Psychology. So I have sort of the experience of being raised with some of the Adlerian Psychology principles I know that we'll talk about today as a child, and then learn more about them as like a mental health practitioner in my adult years and college education. And now today I do practice quite a bit of using the Adlerian Psychology principles and practices in my work with clients today, and then also applying them in other settings outside of therapy, like in group settings, or applying Adlerian Psychology in the classroom or with myself, or in workplace settings, or even how I mentor students and things like that. So that's a little bit of background about me.
Yes, lovely to hear that, having both parents as therapists and then just sort of being raised in an environment must be a unique experience. And mine were at home mom, and I had a dad who was a professor. So a little bit of similarity there as well. And speaking of workplace, could you highlight Adlerian Psychology and the benefits of how that would help us, especially in leading teams in the workplace?
It's a really good question, because Adler's work is very focused on like the social embeddedness of psychology. And like what that means is Adler believed that our mental health could be measured by the degree of the sense of belonging that we have in our social circles, like at work or at school or at home. So because of like the nature of the socially embedded way of psychology that Adler thought about, is it really saw that like our problems and the solutions to our problems are all in social settings, and that to be in the workplace or to be in a position where there's like a leaders and followers, that we have to like get along with each other and to cooperate with each other. And if we feel like in the workplace setting that we don't have a place, or we don't have a way to contribute, or feel like what we're doing is meaningful, we often will struggle in those different parts of our lives. So I think from like a leadership perspective, Adler's ideas very much are relevant, because Adler looks at how can we navigate the social structures in our different cultures and in the different countries that we live in, and the different settings that we're in, that may very much not have a cooperative, egalitarian approach. I think Adler looked at really having more of like, we're equals rather than like maybe like from the perspective of a therapist or mental health setting. You might say like, oh, the therapist is the expert and the client is going to be told what to do. But Adler looked at it more as like, we're equals. So therefore, when you apply that same paradigm of like that we're equals, then it really transforms how we think about leadership, where that like leaders are not just about being, it's not about that this person is better than someone or that they have a higher standing or that there's something superior about them. But I think Adler would look at the responsibility of the person in a place of leadership, and that to like, I think so many of his principles, when you apply them to leadership, can be so powerful, because I think Adler would say like, it's about contribution rather than about being like on a structure of being higher or lower. Or Adler would be more focused on like, I think leading by example. Like he wouldn't be telling people what to do. He'd be in there doing the good work with maybe the folks who maybe he oversees or from a leadership perspective. But that's like, I guess, a few examples of that.
It sounds more like when we're equal, we're collaborating, we're teaching one another, we're learning from one another. It takes so much pressure off of having to have all the answers. And as leaders, we can use the strengths of each individual that are unique in our teams, and we can harvest that. And that just invites everyone to have a buy-in or a ability to contribute in a meaningful way. And when that happens, it brings that joy, inner satisfaction, and an ability to perform at your best. So that really makes perfect sense to me. So we talk about lifestyle in Adlerian psychology, and how does it play in terms of contribution, especially in the workplace that we were just talking about?
So Adler's like concept of lifestyle, it looks at really our personality and the way that we show up in the different parts of our lives with the different people and the different problems that we may have. Maybe like a really short definition is like, lifestyle is like, how do I show up and solve the problems of life? And those problems could be in the workplace, they could be in my love relationship, in my family, in my community. And Adler's looking at like the idea of that our style of life or our lifestyle is a pattern, kind of consistent way that we often will show up and solve problems. And that doesn't necessarily mean like it's a typology of like there's one type of personality that always has to be in control or always has to be perfect or always needs to be the center of attention or be validated. It could be different facets of those personality pieces, like some of those examples that I just listed. But I think Adler would still look at like holistically, like how does that person show up to deal with the problems in the workplace, to deal with the problems in my life that I'm currently struggling with. And then I think with the lifestyle, like assessment, when we're looking at like in coaching or in talk therapy, is really my ability to look at my own strengths and my own liabilities or deficits by understanding the way I show up and seeing like, hey, there's within this sometimes there are mistakes in our mistaken way of solving problems. And then there also maybe are some workable parts of that too. And I think when we're aware of that, like that self-insight or self-awareness helps us to become better parents or helps us to become a better leader or a better therapist or a better person in general. So that's where I think our understanding of lifestyle through Adler's terms is really useful in that it looks at the person holistically. It looks at understanding, again, that pattern way that we show up and solve problems in different facets of our life, and that we're constantly growing and evolving, and we're developing and learning new understandings about ourselves as we maybe get feedback from other people, or as we make a mistake or continue to make a mistake and learn about it through just like life showing up and smacking us in the face.
When is this lifestyle? How does it form? Is it something that you're born with? How does this work?
There are some different schools of thought on that. I know in the Adlerian psychology world, including Adler himself, did talk about that. Like our personality for sure is influenced quite a bit in our early lives. And I know that from like a developmental psychology perspective, that Adler and many Adlerians believe a lot of our personality does get pretty highly influenced before the age of like 6 or 7. So a lot of those experiences and a lot of what's happening in our environment is influential, but we still know developmentally that trauma happens or positive experiences happen, and positive like attachments or teachers or mentors or family members who maybe stepped up to the plate to support us as life evolved and changed as young children. Adler also still really looked at the holistic nature of people as well. So like our experiences are just a small influence, but like what we do with those experiences matters a lot as well. In addition to like the holistic element of personality or our lifestyle, Adler also saw that as a trained medical doctor who was an ophthalmologist, he did see that our biology still influences us too. So today, if you think of like, well, we have genetic loading for cancer, we may have genetic loading for our personality features and our temperament, or we have genetic loading for other health conditions. So the fact that there can be a genetic basis to the different parts of our behavior and our personality show that it's not just our experiences or just our trauma or just the positive people in our lives or just the biological influence, but it's really a mix of various facets and environmental influences, and personality develops around all of these different elements.
This is really, really helpful to me to understand. And that question pops up for me is, for those who might be listening, what is Adlerian psychology? Because we keep talking about Adlerian psychology today.
It's an interesting idea of talking about Adler's work in the psychological training world, like Freud or Sigmund Freud, like psychoanalysis was really the dominant influence as psychology was coming out of like Vienna and the eastern part of Europe, and then influencing the rest of the world. Even though there were other philosophers and other cultures and influences that still influenced psychology, Freud really very much overshadowed Adler. And the interesting thing is, so then people today maybe listening to this podcast may have more of an understanding of hearing more pop psychology terms that have Adler's voice that are sort of like hidden, and his voice sort of hidden under many of the concepts that you hear today in psychology. But Freud's voice very much took a dominant influence in the world of psychotherapy. So when I teach my students about Adler today, a lot of times they're very excited about the ideas of what he's talking about, but a lot of the theories that they learn may have been kind of overshadowed by Freud's influence. So to summarize that, I guess what I'm saying is this theory kind of has stayed hidden historically, because I think Adler didn't really care so much about being famous. I think he was more about contribution and about using his ideas to help people. So therefore, it may not be very common for people to understand what Adlerian psychology is, but if I could shortly describe Adlerian psychology, I would say some of the aspects about it really look at, like I mentioned earlier, our social embeddedness, and that our psychology is understood in social context. So that if we feel like we have a place in the world, or that we belong, or that we can contribute to the world, we're often going to see that associated with more positive mental health, as opposed to the other. If we don't feel like we have a voice, or that we can contribute, or that we have some significance in the world around us, that may often be associated with poor mental health. Some of the main concepts of the theory that people may have heard somewhat about would be the idea of like our family life and our birth order, that our experiences and the way that our family has influenced us very much shows up as an influential variable in psychology. Then we also have like Adler looking at the inferiority complex and striving for significance and superiority as some of the concepts that are the cornerstone of this approach as well, and that we grow up as young children and in that world of being a small person who may not have a loud voice or much influence. We come from a place of inferiority, and we're striving often to overcome that and to have a voice and to have a place in the world. But we may often do that in a discouraged way that may not always solve the problems that we need to solve. And like some of the other elements of the theory for sure look at how we go about solving the problems in our work lives, our family lives, and our love relationships. So Adler very much looked at how we show up to those life tasks that we all have to sort of solve problems within those throughout our lives is a huge part of the theory. And then some of the other parts of the theory for sure look at understanding our personality or our style of life or lifestyle and how that becomes a liability to us at times, and that our strengths also lie within that lifestyle. There's a lot of richness to the theory, so it's very difficult to answer the question in just a few minutes. But those are some of like the key words that pop up in Adlerian psychology.
You spoke about social interest, and that helps with collaboration and team improvement and productivity. And I have a specific question. As leader myself, I've experienced this often. You mentioned someone that shows up when they don't feel significance or belonging in a discouraged way. And as a leader, it's really confusing to understand that this is discouragement. Sometimes it shows up as perhaps they're just not interested. Maybe they're just not performing. In Adlerian psychology with individual, how does a leader support someone instead of judging them for the behavior that they're showing, and kind of get really deep into it and then go into this social interest part of it, where you can really maintain how we also begin to feel towards this person and look at the whole picture?
Yeah, I guess my first reaction to that would be, if there's a discouraged person we're working with, let's say it's an employee and we're maybe like in a leadership position, or for me, in some cases, if I'm a professor and then I'm teaching a student and I see that there's something going on between us that's a problem, and maybe the person isn't performing, or maybe they weren't happy with an evaluation, I think that's the reality, is like, that's life. Like, there's going to be many people we work with that are just great and they do the job or they perform well, but then sometimes people aren't happy with the outcome of an evaluation or the outcome of a project or whatever it may be. And when we have someone who maybe is dealing that we're really struggling to communicate with them, or they're struggling to communicate with us. So I think applying Adlerian psychology to that type of dynamic is interesting. So one is like to understand this person has their way of solving their problems and striving for belonging, significance. And then we also have ours too. And sometimes like we're going to connect with those people, and our lifestyles or styles of life are going to be very compatible. And then sometimes they're going to be like this, where I might like give someone feedback and someone might be so injured by that feedback and it's so painful for them that they maybe retaliate, or maybe they just don't say anything and I have no idea that they're hurt. Or maybe I give someone feedback and they're like, oh, that's so helpful, and they take it in a very positive way. So I think that's where this is really interesting. It's not just like we're analyzing and understanding that this person is discouraged. It's well, also, where am I coming from and how am I interacting with the world around me, with my maybe students or my children or the people that I'm evaluating in the workplace, or having to do an evaluation on someone's work performance that may influence their pay or whatever outcome that we may be looking at. So I think that's a little bit of how I look at it, is our awareness of how we come across to other people and our sensitivity, I think, to knowing that in a leadership position, we're in this sort of privileged position where maybe if we make a mistake, it's not as much of a big deal the way there may be if the other person makes a mistake. So I think to be aware of our power and privilege in leadership positions is in line with an Adlerian perspective of like owning that and being aware of power dynamics. But then I think Adler also would be wanting to look at like when we have two people or a group dynamic and how we're all fitting together or not fitting together. And that lack of fit or fit between our personalities is so important. Like think of a child who doesn't want to be controlled, who has a parent who expects people are going to comply. And then one saying, you're not going to control me. And the other person is saying, you're going to comply with what I say. Well, I think that same dynamic shows up in the workplace, right? Where our employees or our students or the people in different positions that are higher than us or lower than us in the structure that we're working in. And then we have to somehow navigate all of that. So I think Adlerian psychology has us look at the social hierarchies, and Adlerians have a tendency to, rather than looking at higher than lower, Adlerians kind of look at that we're all like on an equal playing field and that we hope the best for everybody, but we also have these roles like boss or supervisor or student or child, and that somehow we try to like figure out all of those power imbalances, and that the leader, the person in the role of power or leadership of the parent or the boss or the teacher, that they have a great responsibility to be aware of those dynamics. If they can't manage those dynamics and they're just power hungry, then we're probably going to have a lot of problems. Or we're going to have, let's say we're really balanced in our approach to like owning power and being able to create egalitarian relationships, but maybe we're dealing with a really discouraged employee or student. I think for me, my role as like an Adlerian, applying my Adlerian hat in leadership situation is that I need to be mindful of like the power that I have, and also to be aware of other people's sensitivities and knowing how to be a good communicator and being able to help people to maybe receive and understand some of that feedback.
This is really, really helpful, especially because when we are discouraged and we want someone, I love the example that you gave of a child, we want them to comply when they really just want the autonomy the most. That creates even deeper challenges. So I recently had my lifestyle assessment done, and I'm in my 50s. So this is the first time that I did that, and it helped me understand myself better. And what is a lifestyle assessment? Because I couldn't explain it to someone. I knew that I just misread myself so much. I would take responsibility when someone, was disappointed or discouraged. And it wasn't that I wanted to please everyone, but I just didn't want to take a part in creating chaos. And what I learned was that I was a good human being. And of course, we all think we're good human beings, but we make decisions in this early childhood that keeps leading. And now we're leaders and we keep bringing that child to work with us on a daily basis. It was so freeing. So what is this assessment? How did it begin in Adlerian psychology, and how does it play out now?
This assessment, could be often done in talk therapy settings by like a therapist or psychologist, mental health professional, and different types of psychology that aren't Adlerian psychology. It might just look like the first session or two where we learn about the person's story, and we might ask some questions to hear like how they solve the problems of life. So like if we're specifically looking at like an Adlerian psychology approach to like understanding myself through the talk therapy world, I often meet with, the idea would be me theoretically I would meet with like an Adlerian psychology practitioner or coach, and they would help me understand how I showed up in life as a child, how those different experiences may have painted the picture of how I saw myself in the world, and then how I navigated my first social life, which is like the family microcosm. And then how I navigated life as I started to move outside of the family life and developed friends and love relationships and eventually moved into my own family. So the lifestyle assessment really is looking at how I showed up in those different spaces of love, work, and school, or the different social domains of our lives. And I guess the idea would be is like learning about my story and how I figured out how to solve problems is where the lifestyle sort of begins. It's like there's a patterned way that I may have shown up, and I may have learned in my family, like I have to always be in control, or I have to always avoid responsibility, or I always need to get someone to take over for me to solve problems. And those maybe were very adaptive roles at one time. And it's learning where maybe those ways of solving problems at one point worked, but that they're not working at different contexts or different developmental times in our lives. So that would be a bit of like that the lifestyle assessment is learning that story about myself and maybe where I solved some of those problems and how those solutions were either strengths or liabilities at different times, and then flip-flopped as I got into a new time in my life. And the ways of navigating that, really, I think Adler developed his approach to helping it through using this lifestyle assessment and learning out like what are our basic mistakes that emerge in the pattern of our lifestyle and how are they getting in our way today. And really he used the lifestyle assessment as like the primary assessment and intervention because as I'm learning about myself and gaining insight, and then Adler really takes the understanding of our lifestyle into then how do we reorient or orient ourselves towards a more adaptive way of solving our problems, or maybe stepping outside of our childish self-focused view of solving problems and having to develop more of another focus. Or maybe some of us just only focus on other people and totally forget ourselves. And that could be a problem too, because that might look like social interest where I'm taking care of others and I'm thinking about other people's needs. But if I forget to take care of myself, that's like being on the airplane where they say, remember, put on your air mask first, then help the folks around you who need help. And I think there's also that balance as well of like, we still need to meet our needs as well as be aware of the needs of others around us, like our families and our loved ones, and somehow try to figure out balancing both of those. So that's a little bit about lifestyle. I'm not sure if I answered all of the questions, but that's some of it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I was also realizing is more we understand ourselves, and when the challenge happens, maybe sometimes it's difficult to figure out what the challenge is until later. But if there's this pattern that keeps emerging, now we can look and say, aha, this is my way of solving problems. And perhaps I can try something different. As leaders, we're talking about valuing contributions from others and understanding it. And leadership is to lead, right? Leading others. And that word itself puts us in, and I like that we can go and say, you know what? I don't have to be the person who takes all the responsibility. It's shared. We work together and we all have roles, not to, dismiss that fact. We're working together and collaborating. And when challenges happen, how can a leader or team members get to know one another in a workplace? So let me just even go back and say a new employee comes into a group. Everyone's already friends and they know the work cycle. And onboarding plays a huge role, but it doesn't sometimes meet the need of this new individual who needs significance and belonging. And they come into a workplace. What are some of the ways that they can feel like they belong, they can contribute in a meaningful way without it taking so long? Because that discouragement, when it sets in, it's hard to then go to encouragement. So two-part question, how can we make someone feel welcomed and bring them to have significance and belonging and not wait so long? And if they do become discouraged, how can we as a team encourage someone who is just so discouraged and given up on themselves?
It's a great question. And in the workplace settings that I've been in, I feel like I've been fortunate to have a lot of socially interested people. So that term coming from Adler, where there are so essentially people who have this desire to contribute and to show interests in other people's interests and connect with others and help create a sense of belonging for themselves and other people. I've really had that, I think, part of the personalities of some of the and the lifestyles of people that I've worked around. So for me, some of the ways that I've seen that be influenced by leadership of people that I've worked with would be that they maybe make some cultural efforts to somehow do team building while also integrating a new person in. Like one thing's at the college counseling center that I worked at, I've seen one thing we've done would be having an onboarding process where there's maybe a meal where we got to maybe have breakfast together all at work where we would literally spend an hour together and just people might talk about some funny stories about themselves or the office and to try to make it comfortable for the new person. So a lot of times we would try to do things around food and activities that were maybe designed to be light, rather than us being in the role of doctor so-and-so and being in the supervisor of that person and the boss is there. We would try to remove all of that and get more on this equal horizontal level where everyone is we're just people showing up and we happen to work together. And, there may be boundaries in what's disclosed there, but there's some level of trying to connect with people on a person to person level. So I would say that's where culture may influence the work culture and the culture maybe of the setting that the country or the state or wherever we live in the world might influence that too. For me, I think the way I tried to do that as an employee seeing new people coming in is personally making efforts whether I was like a supervisor or like in a role, like a leadership role or not, it would be, and it was, I think in both roles, I would try to like check in with the person to like, as they were maybe onboarding or joining a community or a workspace. So I think that there's often personalities who have that desire to connect, who may be the people who also kind of make themselves known as the people who are like concerned about the well-being of these new people. So I think that may naturally happen. And then if you don't have a lot of people who have a lot of social interest, then there may be one or two people who kind of fill in that role. But I do think those dynamics, if there's social interest coming from the leaders and that's modeled by the leaders, I think you also see that happening in the employees too, where they see that happening and like, hey, this is a value about like taking care and trying to make people feel at home, or that they're happy to have them there, versus like a competitive environment where it's like, okay, well, we're going to like, we don't want to connect to you too much because we're competing with you for the whatever raise or outcome. So I think it's like, how do leaders bring in some sense of like not competition, but cooperation? Those are some examples, because I could probably talk about that all day, but I don't know if that gives a little bit of a picture.
It gives a lot of a better picture for us, because as sometimes I know personally, you do onboarding and you do invite everyone together, and their personality, their own beliefs about social gatherings or whatever that might be, they're coming. I know that some employees, when I had operated schools, was the new employee, they're just so nervous about doing the right thing, and they might show up as overwhelmed or confused, and we begin to think, wow, are they either confused or maybe did we hire wrong? And then giving that space and time before making those decisions, looking just that empathy part of it. And what is it that we can do to connect? And I love the idea of having a meal and just breaking down the barriers, because I think we, the leaders, sometimes forget that the belief about leaders out there, or bosses, can influence how they feel about coming into work and how they feel about our interactions with them. And as leaders, when we say something, plays such a heavy role for many people. So just sort of understanding that aspect comes through to the conversation you had. I want to talk about community and building a community. Dr. Adler speaks about that social interest, the Gemeinschaftsgefühl, and maybe you can explain that word and how that fits into a workplace.
I was like thinking exactly the same path of your question as we're talking about that example. And I just have seen like the supervisors or bosses or associate deans or directors or people that I've worked with. I feel like I just had such luck finding jobs where the values of those leaders were very Adlerian, but though people didn't even realize that their values were very in line with Adlerian psychology. So what I mean by that is that I'm thinking of some of the leadership people that I've been like working under or working with, is they saw it more about we're working with each other, that they had a sense of community, that they didn't value competition, that they valued connection and they valued community. And that might look like, for me at the university at the end of the semester, that might look like that people in leadership value like, hey, should we all get together and kind of celebrate our efforts this year? As opposed to like not thinking about that and being so busy with the end of the semester. I think of like clinical directors and counseling jobs where we would do things at the end of the semester to like take care of each other and ourselves. Like we might go on like a cruise, like a short, like half day cruise that's very inexpensive, and just like kind of decompress together, and that they would make space and value that. Like, so they would value sort of community care and the values around self-care in the workplace, and like that we do things to have fun. Like, so one of the things that I like to do in some of those workspaces is like, I've been a drummer for many years, but I would always like volunteer my like social interest services to others. So I like to do a lot of group drumming. And I know that not everyone is a drummer or a musician, but I would try to like do it in a way where I'm like, hey, this is for people who aren't musicians, and we're just going to like have fun and get people laughing, and it's really light. And then therefore people don't feel like they need to like perform or like be a professional musician, which they're not. So for me, a lot of times at the end of the year or the end of a quarter or whatever it may be in the workplace setting, we might try to do some group drumming as like a debriefing activity where we just like totally don't even talk about work or problems or work tasks. And we just like do this way of like connecting with each other through music. I've done that many times for different like workspaces, and it's always been very fun because we just get to like step into like a child's mind of like playfulness and creativity, and out of like this, maybe the serious, like we have to grade papers or do therapy or whatever our tasks are in the workplace. So for me, that's one effort when you have people who like can bring in something that taps into community. One thing I like to do at the end of my classes, towards the end of the semester, is like a community building activity. And I just learned this reading it is in a book, and I don't have a reference where I read it, but you could change this in any concept. This could be like at a workplace meeting where we take 15, 20 minutes to do something like this, and you can pick from one of the three. It could be an appreciation for someone. It could be an apology to someone or to everyone. Or it could be an aha, like something I learned about myself or that I learned in the workplace or in the class that really stood out to me. And a lot of people have a tendency to gravitate toward the appreciation. And what happens when I do that in a class is people start saying things that they had never really said to connect, but someone might say, oh, this person met me at the beginning of the semester and I felt like they made me feel comfortable by just doing these things. And it creates like an emotional like bonding that happens by asking people to step into that kind of appreciation, aha, apology. And sometimes the apologies can be funny too, where people might say, sorry, my cell phone kept going off, or like, I'm sorry, I did this thing that made people's lives a little difficult. But by doing something like that, I think it allows the community sense to grow. It allows us to learn about our impact on each other. And it can just take like some of our workplace meetings or a classroom setting and bond us even further. So those are like some examples of, I think, like when you pull in activities that somehow get us to step outside of our like serious part of our like adult personalities where we have to like work or solve problems or deliver what our deliverables are in the workplace. This like sometimes can be really useful to like have a leader that values those types of discussions, community-based activities.
John, what you just shared about having fun. Often when we have a sprint, we in the workplace and we just go to the next one. But having something where you're taking a time to assess the situation. How did it go? Did it go well? What are the areas of improvement? And I love the three, either an appreciation, apology, or an aha. And it's interesting when you said most people chose appreciation. And I was thinking most people would choose apology because everyone thinks differently. And this is where that belief system and everything that comes from taking all the responsibility or looking external. It is so exciting that you just shared about drumming. And it's work, right? So work in the Adlerian theory is anything that you do that that serves the purpose. So work is something that's meaningful to you and without which we would feel really not as whole. So that brings me to holism. So we speak about holism in Adlerian psychology. And what does that mean? You can share it in layman terms because it's such a grand picture. And then when we understand that, it makes perfect sense in our workplace. It's not just our little team, but it's the whole organization.
Yeah, holism has definitely been an appeal to me as far as my interest in Adlerian psychology. And I think there's different angles that I want to take to answering it. I see part of holism from my understanding of reading Adler's work is like looking at the person and the different facets of their lives and how they all interconnect. Like for example, we could think of holism as far as like the mind-body connection. But then Adler says it's more than the mind-body. It's like, and the social and the spiritual and the different aspects of our lives that influence us and the experiences that influence us. So I think part of holism is understanding that we aren't just our thoughts. We aren't just our behaviors. We aren't just our biological influence. We're all of these pieces. And Adlerians like to not break people down into separate pieces, but to see the interconnectedness of those different parts of ourselves. When we understand like the holism of Adlerian psychology, at least in therapy terms, it ends up looking like, for me, from my like vantage point of doing a lot of therapy and teaching about therapy, it's like seeing how all of the pieces that we learn about psychology and human behavior, how they all have like an influence on us. So if we look at ourselves holistically, understanding like what I do in one area often will reflect in other areas. So if I have to be just perfect at work, holistically, I probably have a tendency of perfectionism and doing things just right, or being perfect, or feeling good enough in that perfection in other settings. Or if I have a tendency to let others take over and kind of rely on others to solve my problems, and sometimes pushing responsibility towards others, I might do that in different aspects of my life, not just in my love relationships, but maybe at work and in other social spheres, like in the family or in my community. And the way that that shows up as a pattern is our style of life, or our lifestyle. But yeah, for me, when I teach students about the different theories, it's really interesting because Adler's voice shows up in so many different theories, and looking at the behaviors and looking at our thinking and looking at our family life and the influence and the patterns in our relationships. That holism is really understanding the person and all of the sort of like the elements or the pieces of their lives that influence where they got today and where they're going in the future. So it's really not so much looking back where we've been, but more so saying, I look back and I see that that may have had an influence, but Adler looked so much more on where are we going and what are we striving for? What are our goals? And the holistic part and the goal orientation of Adlerian psychology has probably been, for me, the most interesting parts of the theory.
Definitely fascinating, especially the holism. And it brings up, we keep talking about work and life balance, you know. So if we show up one way in one surrounding and we're giving it our all, and then we're not paying attention to the other parts of it, it could create some challenges. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to how does this work? You know, we have different areas of ourselves. And I mean, when I get busy and I'm working, it brings me so much joy that I get really into it. And then I know personally that it affects me negatively, because then I might not go and work out or tend to my garden, which are the ways that I get fulfilled in different ways, or spirituality if I don't meditate. This interconnectedness of it all and then cause effect in terms of Adlerian psychology would be really helpful.
That is like the $100 million question and answer of like where people can find work-life balance. And I do think Adler's theory does some justice when it comes to that, when it gives us an understanding of like human nature through seeing the social spheres that we navigate through with work, love, and family and community. So when we have those different aspects of ourselves, if we only attend to just work and we forget about family and our relationships, then that balance is really difficult. For me, what I often will do with my clients is I'll see, well, where are they overperforming and where are they underperforming in some of these parts of themselves? So if we're so focused on work or just on family life, but then we forget about life outside of that, there may be that imbalance that we may help our employees or our clients or our students to try to find balance. And for me, that's always the challenge, is like, am I taking care of myself? Have I gotten out in nature today? Have I thought about some of the work tasks that need to be attended to? Have I thought about family life or people in my family and how I want to attend to them? If we could find the equation to find the perfect balance, we probably make a lot of money. Not that that's what we're after, but I know that this looks so different for different people, and that our culture influences that family work-life balance for sure. And that in many cultures, especially in the United States, the value on being a workaholic and success is so high. And then in collectivist cultures, it's not that they don't value success and work, but I think collectivist cultures do a better job at finding that balance with work and family and social. So I think it's going to look different depending on our cultural influences and our level of competition and how much we're trying to strive for significance through our work and through the different life tasks that we have. So I haven't found the perfect balance, but I'm always striving to try to find a little bit of balance in all of those.
There is no such a thing, because until you start to pay attention to one area more, and then when you start to notice that's now it's affecting you, it's sort of like, okay, I have to shift gear. Maybe I've been driving in drive, and maybe I just need to park for a minute, and maybe I just need to make a left and a right if we're using the metaphor of driving, because sometimes we drive because it's bringing us all of that. Communication also, I think when we are facing in certain direction and we're showing and modeling this behavior as leaders, employees might feel that they need to follow or do the same, because what's valuable to us is work without that balance. And before long, and you spoke about holism, everyone else around us is in the same situation, and those stressors come up. And having that drumming session, perhaps having an outing and where we're just relaxed. Of course, we know our cultures, we know our responsibility, but just being, I think for me, coming from different part of the culture, born and raised in India and came to US, leadership view was hierarchy. It was just, they're the bosses and you comply and you listen and you don't speak back and you follow the rules and you work really, really hard because you're so grateful. And it's interesting that now that I've shifted to say, well, it's and both. It's definitely we respect the work that we have, but we also respect self. And when we do both, then we feel really, in level, in parallel to the situations that we have at work. So I think that modeling piece that you brought up through the conversation you had, are there any other aspects in terms of, so you spoke about the relationship, the love. What is that love part that we're speaking about in terms of feeling whole?
Yeah, so a life task like of love is definitely an important task for most people, that there's just a hard wiring in us to want to connect and to belong, and for many for touch and intimacy. I would say it's a big part of like our work-life balance. Like if we feel connected and we feel that we are loved and can love, that's often going to be connected to like our mental well-being at more on a higher functioning side. I would say that for people who are maybe not currently in a love relationship, there's still other ways that people can meet some of those needs. Like if someone is currently like in the dating world and they're not currently maybe feeling that sense of love and connection, that's still where love and connection can still be towards others too. That can be towards friends and family, where we might meet some of those love needs in our social worlds, where it's like, for example, getting like a big hug from a close friend might feel really meaningful to someone who maybe hasn't had a hug in a long time or just had even physical touch. So yeah, that life task is a big part of our lifestyle, because, for example, when we learn about someone's patterns and relationships, we often learn a lot about their striving and their goals and their lifestyle, because the things that attract us to people often show you a lot about people's lifestyle and maybe how is their striving to be like very vertical, to really be wanting to be the best and to be seen as the best, or being with the most attractive person or the most successful person. So yeah, the people we strive to connect to and belong and relate to definitely are a reflection of our internal sort of nature. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's, I think it's a big part of our social interest, is like feeling that connected to others often still is part of that connection. Those needs may be met through love and through our close, intimate relationships.
This is what brought to my mind is the collaborative efforts at work, because through that, sometimes, but based on our belief, we can feel loved or cared for when someone takes a little bit of time to show us the steps, maybe when things are just overwhelming. Not everyone knows every aspects of it. That's why we work in teams, so we can bring strengths of, our unique strengths to the table. And then when this value aspect comes in, when you feel cared for, it doesn't have to be like love as in we, have this term love towards our boyfriend, girlfriend, but just that intimacy, the part that the friendship that you speak about in workplace, because often we separate too much, and then that could also be a challenge. But when there is a balance of it all and we can collaborate, we can have a little meal or coffee or check in on one another. And this also brings to mind the different age groups, different cultures that play a huge role in our workplace. What are some of the ways that you have seen in your experience in the profession that you're in? Because sometimes folks who've been doing this work for a long time, now they're older in technology and things have happened to change things. What are some of the ways that you bring their value and invite them to feel the sense of contribution? Because, they've been here for a while and they're on their way to retiring. They still hold so much to offer.
Yeah, I think that's a huge consideration for the workplace, for a classroom, that we have folks that are different ages with different values and different experiences. And how do we somehow navigate all of that when you might have a whole staff or classroom or whatever it may be who are very technologically inclined and are very familiar with the use of apps and cell phones and the convenience of technology, and some folks who are not digital natives who really struggle with that. And then how do you get them to connect when connection today might be through social media, through TikTok, through different forms of relating? So I think for me, that's where in the workplace setting, and for me, in like when I teach, is like I try to be mindful of that as well, knowing that people connect differently. Like not all people are going to want to connect with each other through a coffee, maybe outside of the workplace or a classroom. Maybe they're going to connect more so on apps and like tagging each other in videos or doing really entertaining things. But then how does that make a person feel who maybe doesn't have those apps? And how do you still build community with folks when they aren't all on the same playing field as far as level of familiarity or interest in technology or not? So I think that's where, for me, it's figuring out how do you bring everyone together and getting them to interact, knowing that there's such differences for how people connect and to relate to each other. And there's different comfort levels of socialization and connection. I was thinking this morning about a drum circle that I did in Romania at like an Adlerian Psychology Summer Institute about, and I think it was in 2019. And I remember there was probably someone in their 90s in the drum circle. And there's all these people from the Adlerian Institute and all these people in the community who weren't related to the Institute who saw us drumming in a park, and they came and joined us. And we probably had 100 people dancing and clapping, and we had like 50 drums. We had lots of drums. And I remember seeing this 3-year-old and the 90-year-old looking at each other, and I'm pretty sure they didn't know each other. They were just sitting by each other, and there was this sense of connection, and they were both contributing, and they were both part of this experience of music, and they both weren't musicians. So for me, I think I kind of see that as like a metaphor for like, how do we bring that to the workplace, where it's like both of these people were not drummers. They both didn't wake up that morning and probably say, I want to drum today. But somehow they ended up in this situation where we're on this equal playing field, and we were both of those people, and the 98 other people and me, were part of this really interesting community experience. So for me, I try to figure out how can I create that dynamic with my students, or if I'm in a workplace setting and I'm like maybe in like a supervisory leadership position, how do I create that dynamic in Romania with the different levels of technology and cultural influence and values around how people connect, and cultural values around connection and things like that. So I know that that's more of a comparison, but I'm always looking for those, like, how do we do that through team building, icebreakers, through these different ways of helping people to relate to each other, knowing that drumming isn't going to do it for everybody, and knowing that a conversation isn't going to do it for everybody. I often try to shift the medium too. So sometimes I'm like doing these community activities that might be around music, or I might ask people like an Adlerian question about like an early memory, and think you could have someone in a class who is maybe in their 70s and someone who's in their early 20s. And then you ask them both, what was like a memory you have about like an educational experience that was really meaningful to you? And then they both share that with each other. Or for example, if I ask people to talk about their favorite childhood toy, and having folks like connect to the feelings and emotions of that can often be like a really interesting way of connecting people around something they weren't used to connecting to people around, because maybe they just think of connection as talking, coffee, or whatever. But yeah, I think that's one way I try to navigate. I think what your question was.
Yeah, sounds just so beautiful. As we end, I'd like to inspire the listener to create a drum circle, metaphorically, at your workplace, using music, melody, connections in many ways, understanding yourself, understanding others, many, many tools that we can use that we heard from you, Dr. Sperry, today. And thank you for being here. And for listeners, if you like the content of this podcast, please follow and let us know what other podcast topics that you'd be interested in. For now, I am Yogi Patel, talking with Dr. Jonathan Sperry, and you are listening to Jagged Edge. If you like the content of this video, please don't forget to follow. And also, if you want more information, visit the website, yogipateltte.com.